Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenburg back on the line, and today we're going to be talking about what has been going on with Azure Active Directory, or Azure Entra, Microsoft Entra, right? You see the confusion. So we're going to be talking about Entra, what it is, what some of the new technologies in Entra are, all that and more coming up on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got a regular co-host back on the show here, Paul Schnackenburg. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. It's been a busy world in the world of IT and security, which is always the case, right? But I feel like it's been a little bit more so the last couple of weeks, months here. There's been a lot going on, especially in the world of cloud security. And really, that's what we're going to talk about today. But before I get there, just in case the off chance any of our listeners haven't watched a previous episode with you in it, can you give us a little bit of info on yourself and what you do in the community?
Sure. So I run my own business here in Australia. I've been in IT for nigh on 30 years now. And I write articles. I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I deliver training. And that's me.
You're a busy guy, and you're a name I see all over the place. So you certainly no problem staying busy, I'm sure. So anyway, well, today, I mentioned cloud security, which is kind of a hint at what we're talking about today. And really, we're going to focus on kind of one key part of the Microsoft cloud world, and that is identity, right? And I mean, when you talk about security, like identity is kind of rolled up into that definition, right? Because, okay, I'm trying to access this piece of data here. Am I who I say I am? And am I allowed access to that piece of data, right? Which is kind of, when you break it down to its most simple form, that's kind of what it comes down to. But for, I don't even know how long, as long as I have been in IT, Active Directory has kind of been like the name around identity in the space, right? So, I mean, I've been in the industry for 21 years-ish now, give or take a year, for my bad math. But, it's interesting. So what I want to spend some time talking about at the beginning of this episode is the recent brand change. And for those that aren't aware, Microsoft recently changed the name of Azure Active Directory, and it's now called Azure Entra, E-N-T-R-A, right? And it's kind of interesting, right? So I guess, first off, a couple of things. The first thing I had to do when I started prepping for this episode is like, okay, I've heard the name Entra all over the place, right? I've seen the news releases, I've seen the blog posts, I've seen the article headings, right? What does Entra actually mean? Well, turns out it's Spanish for to enter, which kind of makes sense for an identity service, right? As somebody who's a native Spanish speaker, hopefully that's correct. I just did a quick Google search, and it told me that's what it is, so I'm assuming it's correct. But anyway, I don't know. What do you think about this name change, Paul?
This is we could have a long conversation, but let's not. Lots of ink has been spilled on this one. So, but basically, I like the name change. It's just 10 years too late. I have had, every time I deliver training, I have to explain that Azure AD has nothing to do with AD. Yes, they have the same name, and yes, you store users and groups in both, and they control access to resources. But other than that, they got absolutely nothing to do with each other. It's not the fact that it was called Azure AD, it's not an Azure feature per se. You don't sign up to it in a subscription. The only link is that if you have a tenant with an Azure AD tenant in it, now an Entra ID tenant, You can link it to a default subscription. That's the only thing that's got anything to do with Azure per se.
Right.
And it's definitely not Active Directory. It doesn't do Kerberos. It doesn't do any of those other things. And in fact, if you actually want to have Active Directory functionality in Azure, you've got to have a different service called Azure AD, Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So AADDS will give you what you want, which is basically domain controllers run by Microsoft in Azure.
So, okay, so let's put away the Entra designation for just a second. We've got Azure AD, which has been around since Azure has really been a thing. But to your point, like you said, it's not an Azure thing. It spans Microsoft Cloud Services, because if I have nothing running in Azure and I just have an M365 subscription, surprise, I have Azure AD, right? Because M365 depends on Azure AD. And in fact, a lot of the M365 outages, correct me if I'm wrong here, Paul, but a lot of the recent outages over the last year has been because of problems with Azure AD.
Yeah.
So, but I guess this comes back to, like, I have so many issues with naming conventions that Microsoft uses. So again, putting aside the Entra designation, which I agree with you, I think it's a good change for delineating it for what it is and separating it from that name Active Directory. But for, 10 years now, or however long both these services have been around, I don't think AADDS has been around that long, but so I have Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, and then I have Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which, if I came from the on-premises world, I know that AD does domain services, so then I'm like, oh, well, that's AD in the cloud, which, not to be confused with Azure AD. And people have heard me rant about this one before. I have to bring up the whole Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack thing as well, because for those that aren't aware, Azure Stack and Azure Stack HCI are two entirely different things. Azure Stack is like your own private version of Azure running inside your data center, and Azure Stack HCI is just, a kind of modified version of Windows Server with Hyper-V, Storage Spaces Direct, SDN, and all that stuff we've been using on premises for all these years, all rolled up into one. So I really want this. I feel like this is marketing run amok, and those are your words in the outline for this episode, but I totally wholeheartedly agree with that.
There's a lot of marketing people at Microsoft, and they do seem to have a little bit too much power when it comes to renaming everything every year. It confuses people, and I don't think it's necessary. There is a little bit of method to the madness here. So you got Entra, which is all sort of the identity-related things, including now Entra ID. But you also have Priva, which is everything related to privacy. So all the features in Microsoft 365 that give you privacy, they're all under the Priva or Priva, umbrella term. And then you have all the information governance and information protection and data loss protection under the Purview brand. So there is some method to the madness. And as I said, we certainly could have avoided a lot of confusion if we'd called it Entra ID 10 years ago. But there you go.
Well, we got there eventually. Yeah. It took 10 years. I wonder what we'll call it 10 years from now.
Exactly.
So the question I come back to with this type of change, really any brand change like this, is like, is it helpful for the Microsoft Cloud? I think it's helpful from the standpoint of like, okay, some of the confusion has been removed. But if I really think honestly about it, I think at the end of the day, IT professionals, security professionals, they don't really care what the name is as long as they know what the feature is, what it does, and what problem it solves for them, right?
Yep. That's really what it comes down to for sure.
Interesting. Well, being as we're already on the topic of Entra, I know there's some new stuff that has been added into that stack recently, so I figured we could spend some time talking about that as well. But before we get to that, I know there are some key acronyms that you wanted to make sure that we kind of set a baseline here, right? And that's everybody listening is groaning right now because that's what our industry needs is more acronyms, right? But correct me if I'm wrong. I think you said these came from Gartner, right? So the first one is SASE, Security Access Service Edge. The next one is SSE, Security Service Edge. And then we have ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access, right? Do you want to give us a quick rundown on each one?
All right. So bottom line is this. Forrester went with zero trust, and they have been talking about zero trust. They didn't invent the term, but they have been talking about zero trust for a long time, and it's a very commonly accepted term in the industry now.
Right.
Gartner went with SASE, which in some ways are sort of talking about the same thing. However, the way Gartner was seeing it back in 2019, just before COVID came around, was saying, okay, you need a cloud service that gives you all of your firewalling, all of your traffic control, all of your quality of service from a control plane in the cloud. That way, if your workforce is mobile, it doesn't matter where they are, which branch office, which head office, or working from home, wherever they are, they will all have the same control. And then they married that, and that's the A bit, they married that with the wide area network management. So you would have like a dynamically managed wide area network between all your locations, and that would all come from the same vendor. Turned out that no vendor actually provided all of those features. So then a couple of years later, they came out with SSE, which is a sort of more scaled down version of that. So it's got all the security bits in it, but doesn't have the WAN bits in it. And the Entra Global Access, Secure Access, and the Internet Access and Private Access we're going to talk about today, they are all SSE, or both. They are SSE solutions. And that fits into the Zero Trust Network Access. So Microsoft has been on the Zero Trust journey for a long while here, talking to us about it, but it's been very identity-focused and device-focused, i.e., this user account or this workload identity that is trying to connect to this thing, should they have access? Do we have a policy that allows that or blocks that? And is this device okay to connect to this particular application or resource? But we haven't focused on the network. So these services brings that zero trust to network access. And it literally does, because in conditional access policies, which most IT professionals will be familiar with, you can now, they're in public preview at the moment, you can literally add conditions in your conditional access policies that say you have to be on this network to be able to access this thing.
Which is kind of like the next step, right? Like you said, we've approached all of this from the standpoint, especially of identity over the last couple of years. And it's weird, I'm old enough and been in the industry and long enough now to where you start to see patterns. And I feel like every couple of years we come back to the network in terms of security, right? It seems like we forget about it for a few years and we work on this new shiny stuff over here. But every so often we come back and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, we're beefing up the network security again, right? So it's always interesting to see that and kind of see those parallels based on past experience. So if I'm looking at these two new features, we've got Entra Internet Access and Entra Private Access. I know that these might be new services for a lot of people. I think these are both in public preview, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so looking at Entra Internet Access, basically it looks like, hey, I want to have a cloud firewall for my users, right? Is essentially what it comes down to.
Yep, that's a good description of it. It's called the Secure Web Gateway, or an SWG, which is the sort of the industry term for this kind of feature. There's plenty of others, Zscaler and a few others that do this as well. Now, you do need an agent for both of these. It's the same agent. Currently, that's a download for Windows 11. But they are going to integrate it eventually into the operating system. And when we say public preview, there's a bunch of bits that are in private preview. So there are agents coming for Mac OS, iOS, Android, etc. but at the moment it's Windows only for you to test this. And you build these traffic profiles that acquire the traffic and direct it to Microsoft's SSE. So in both these cases, one of the big points here is Microsoft's network, wide area network globally between all their data centers and everywhere else, is, by some counts, I don't know that you could actually get a valid answer to this, but by some counts, it's the second largest network in the world after the internet.
Yeah, I believe it.
So the whole point here is you get your traffic onto that network as fast as possible because they got hundreds of points of presence around the world. So by doing that, you get a much better traffic profile because their network is not as unreliable or as jittery as the rest of the internet.
Interesting. A couple of things that I want to dig into there a little bit. So first off, you mentioned Windows 11. Have they given any indication that you're aware of for support for past versions of the OS?
Oh, they're definitely going Windows 10 as well.
I was going to say that would be a very strange omission. No. And then the other thing you mentioned of if there's plans to eventually bake it into the operating system. I mean, I guess it makes sense because I know we're going to talk about Entra private access here in a second, but I mean, there's baked in VPN capabilities inside the OS, so it kind of makes sense. Yep. And this is probably a topic for an entirely different podcast episode, but I feel like with a lot of things, I feel like we're approaching an antitrust discussion again at some point. You know what I mean? Like, hey, let's throw this in the OS, and let's throw this in the OS, and they've been doing that a lot lately. And I'm not here to judge one way or the other. It's just an observation, right? But I thought about that when you were saying it. So
I can, I think so. I can relate to that comment. Yes.
So it's, and again, maybe that is the long-toothed IT pro in me. I remember back in the early days of my career when Microsoft and antitrust were often used in the same sentence, but I digress. That's not what we're talking about in this particular episode. Speaking of patterns, right? That's kind of where my brain is going here. But I want to spend some time talking about the other service that we mentioned. We just mentioned Entra Internet Access, but we also have Entra Private Access. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, Paul. This basically is a VPN replacement, correct?
Yeah. It is. Before we leave Internet Access, I did want to pop in a couple more comments there. First of all, is one of the cool features is it restores the original IP address. So a lot of these features, once from the third-party, Zscalers, etc., they often rewrite the IP address to the one from the gateway, and that makes it really hard to track logs, and it makes it really hard to build conditional access policies because they all look like they're coming from this one location. This Entra Internet Access actually rewrites that back to the original one, so you can see that. So that's kind of cool. We should also point out that at the moment, the only thing that's in the public preview is Microsoft 365 traffic. The actual internet traffic and blocking categories, etc., is still in private preview. Hasn't come yet.
That is kind of an important distinction there, right? So, I mean, it's not there, but it only works for 365 traffic today, which... interesting choice, but I'm sure there's a reason for it. What I've learned over the years working with Microsoft is there's often a reason behind these decisions. So I'm going to have to ponder this one between now and whenever we talk about this next.
Licensing has not been revealed yet, but it sounds like Microsoft 365 traffic, so all your Word, Excel, and all other Office traffic going directly to SharePoint and Exchange Online and Teams and everything else, is going to be included in your Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 licensing.
Okay.
However, the Internet Access and the Private Access is going to be a separate SKU. We have no idea about licensing. And the last thing I wanted to mention on Internet Access was the condition. I'll try that again. Continuous access evaluation.
There we go. Yep.
So That feature is today available. It's been GA for, I don't know, a year or two for Microsoft products, meaning that if you have somebody leave your organization under not so good circumstances and you really want to cut off their access really quickly, when you disable their account, it'll take a few minutes and they will be then locked out of Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, etc. It used to be an hour until the refresh token expired.
Right, exactly. And that
But,
ruffled a lot of feathers, right? Because that token would hang around for a while, and a lot of people would get worried about that with good reason. But anyway, sorry, continue.
Well, Microsoft implemented CAE, but it only works for Microsoft tools because the client actually needs to go looking for these special signals that, hey, this account now needs to be disabled. Because you now have the SSE in place, the Secure Service Edge with Entra Internet Access, you will be able to do this for any app, which is kind of nice because it blocks access to, I don't know, Salesforce or whatever else you have your users using. You can block that access almost instantaneously.
Right. And to your point about the licensing, so we don't know exactly how the licensing is going to work for this yet. And which is always a question mark whenever any new service comes out inside of M365 or the general Microsoft Cloud, right? You and I actually did an episode about licensing security features in M365. So maybe when this comes out, that episode will be obsolete. I can't imagine it'll be entirely obsolete. But to my point, it's going to add to the pile of licensing complexity for security services, right? So, again, for those folks that are interested, I will link that in the show notes alongside this episode in case you want to check that out. Because licensing is everyone's favorite topic, right? That said,
our
it
most
was a
popular episode ever, I'm sure.
you know, I'm gonna have to look at the stats on that one. Now I'm curious, but it is a good episode. But everybody despises licensing with good reason, right?
We do. I do.
Anyway, Entra private access. So again, kind of a VPN replacement, right?
Yeah. So for many years, Microsoft has had something called the Azure AD proxy. So you've got web apps on premises and you want to publish those to your users, but you don't want to open holes in your firewall and do NAT traversal and whatever else. So what you do is with now Entra application proxy, you put some little agents on premises, you hook those up to Entra in the cloud, and now your users can access these applications and then get published through Entra ID, formerly Azure AD, and users can just click on those tiles and they don't even realize that those applications are internal web apps. But it only works for web apps. So Entra private access changes that. Instead of just doing web traffic, it will do everything. At the moment, it's TCP only, but that does mean you can do SMB file shares and you can do SSH tunnels into managed servers. UDP is coming, and the beauty of this is that eventually the same agent will work both for the Entra app proxy and Entra private access. At the moment, it's two different agents. So you got to put them on two different servers, but eventually it will be the same agent. So this is the agent that you put on premises or in another cloud, right? Maybe you have an application sitting in AWS. You want to give your users access to it, but you don't want to publish it on the internet, right? You don't want to have public access to it. Well, you can do private access, stick an agent onto a server in AWS and publish it that way.
Boy, I could see that being immensely helpful, especially because I mean, multi-cloud is becoming more common these days. I know for a long time there was this concerted effort to, okay, I'm going to put everything in Azure Cloud or everything in AWS, but I've been hearing it more and more lately where like, okay, we leverage services from multiple clouds, right? I've even heard Linode and Oracle popping up in those discussions from time to time too lately. So anyway, interesting.
And the beauty of this, of course, as you say, it is a VPN replacement, but it is also more modern because this is a per app connection. So when I connect to that app, that's the only app I'm connected to, right? I mean, obviously, you could have multiple apps that I could be connected to, but I'm not network connected. With a traditional VPN, once you VPN in, that client machine is now part of the corporate network. So if you have malware on that machine, it can now spread on the network. Whereas here, you're literally just connected to that one application, each individual application that you publish. And so there is no general network access from my client. Does that make
Right.
sense?
And it does make sense. So disclaimer, I haven't dug into this service myself yet. So, and I know you've done some tinkering with it on your end, Paul. I guess the first thing that comes to mind is just kind of from a high level, how's it facilitating? So if it's just the app, is it only tunneling the needed ports for that application then, or is it using the agent, or exactly?
So the agent publishes the information into Entra. That's why you don't need to open any inbound ports.
Right.
And then what sorry, sorry, I should have my terminology right. The connector that you put on premises where you publish your application. So let's say a file share, right? So you put
Right.
the connector onto a Windows server on-prem, and then you go in and you configure, which you do in the portal, to say, I want this file share on this server to be available through Entra Private Access. So that's the connector that sits there, and that stops you
Okay.
having to open any inbound firewall ports on your firewall, because you definitely don't want to open up any inbound SMB firewall ports on your firewall.
No, not even a little bit.
So that's the connector. That's now published to the cloud, sitting in a traffic profile in your Entra Private Access configuration. Now you put the agent onto a client machine, at the moment Windows, but eventually it's going to be any type of machine. And that agent downloads that traffic profile, acquires the traffic when you try to open that file share, and says, well, you're not physically on the corporate network with your Windows laptop. Therefore, I'm going to have to tunnel you. And it then tunnels that connection to that file share, and that file share only, over your connection. So from the end user, it looks like, hey, I'm on the network and I can get to my file share.
Interesting. So it kind of simplifies a lot of things. I'm going to have to dig into that one because that one's highly interesting, especially for certain scenarios. For sure. Boy, we could almost do a whole episode just on that and all the things that you could do with it. So that's very interesting. I know the other thing that you wanted to talk about, kind of centered around these two services, were the tenant restrictions, right? So tenant restrictions V1, V2, universal tenant restrictions.
Yep. So they come up in this conversation. So I won't spend lots of time on this, but the basic concept is this: you have a corporate network, you have a Microsoft 365 tenant or an Entra ID tenant. Your users are signing into that tenant, but they are also collaborating with other tenants, other organizations, and they're using their own credentials to sign into those tenants as guests. Now, you may want to have control over that. Maybe there are some tenants you want to block and say, well, you can't work with this other company because they're a direct competitor and we don't want you signing in there, right?
Right.
You may also want to block personal Microsoft accounts. Maybe you don't want people to be using that. Well, all of that traffic goes to the same endpoint, login.microsoftonline.com.
Yep.
So you can't just block login.microsoftonline.com, because now you're blocking everything to sign into anything.
Break all kinds of stuff.
Whereas, like, if you don't want people to use Google, you can block Google, right? You can block Google signing endpoint, right? But here you've got to have some more policies. Now, version 1 came out, gave you some control, but there was a lot of endpoint configuration. Version 2 came out, was a little bit better, gave you more granular control, used group policy to push out policies to end user machines, etc. But it was Edge only. So if you were using different browser, you weren't in scope. So if you're using Entra Internet Access / Private Access, overall term is Global Secure Access. So if you're using Entra Global Secure Access, you can now use universal tenant restrictions, and you don't have to do all that extra configuration because it's all managed through this cloud control plane. So that's essentially it, right? Like, if you want to summarize what we just spent 20 minutes trying to explain, is you move the control of a traffic flow into a cloud control plane where you set up policies for what can talk to what, under what conditions, using conditional access. So, for example, if you have a high business impact app on premises that you want to publish out, you can tag it as high impact. Then you can build a conditional access policy that says if you're trying to access this policy from outside of the network, you need to perform a phishing resistant MFA to get to this application every single time.
Right.
Whereas this low impact application over here, we don't care. You can just use a username and password, right? So you get this incredible control with conditional access policies.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and there's more that I would love to drill into on this particular topic, but we're about out of time for the episode. I know one thing that I want to drill into maybe in a future episode is, if I put my system admin hat back on and I start thinking about deploying something like this, like, okay, what's my failover scenario here? What if Entra becomes unavailable for some reason? How do I handle that situation? That's go figure. There I am thinking about my backup situation, and I've been working for a backup organization for the last 8 years in some way, shape, or form. Surprise, surprise. I know the other things that we wanted to get into a little bit, but we're a bit short on time, is the cloud app security broker, now known as Defender for Cloud Apps. And then, of course, how all of this relates to some of the recent Microsoft Cloud breaches, right? Probably the most current hot topic breach would be the Storm 0558 breach, which was where the Chinese nation-state threat actors procured a consumer signing key and basically were using it to forge authentication tokens. Any Entra discussion I've seen lately always has the question like, okay, would this Entra feature have helped that issue? And when I look at these, I mean, these have nothing to do really with the authentication process itself, which is what that particular breach involved.
No, there's none of these features would have had anything to help with there. And I think it's worth mentioning that was an expired key that expired in 2021 and still worked. And it doesn't feel like an expired key to me.
No.
It feels like a very much unexpired key. So I don't know what happened.
And that's and when they released that little tidbit of information, I'm like, I don't know if that makes me feel better or worse,
worse, much worse. We'll get back to that in another episode.
Oh, yeah, now, as far
exactly. As comparing internet access, so Microsoft has a product called Defender for Cloud Apps. It's been in market for quite a few years. It's a very popular product, and it does some of the same things. So it'll be interesting to see how they overlap. As far as private access, apart from the VPN Microsoft has had in Windows for 20 years plus, there is also a product from Microsoft called Microsoft Tunnel, but that is very iOS and Android focused.
Right.
You've got an app on your phone and you want to tunnel that back into some data on premises, you can use the Microsoft Tunnel solution. But private access is a much broader and wider solution.
Right. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how these evolve over time here, but we'll definitely keep an eye on them. And sounds like you and I are going to be planning a part 2 maybe, or something that's focused a little bit more on one of these other topics we mentioned. We always have great conversations here, Paul, so I always appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your knowledge. It's almost I get as much value out of just your knowledge on these subjects as ideas for future episodes, right?
That's good. That's good.
It is good.
Keeps us both employed. I think that works.
That's very helpful. Yes, definitely. So, well, I think that's about all the time we have for this particular episode, Paul. Thanks again for coming and sharing your knowledge. And those of you watching, if you found value in today's episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We are available on YouTube, all the major podcasting platforms, audio and video format as well. So if you're listening to this and you would like to see our smiling faces, you can go out to YouTube and you can find us there. Also, we spend a lot of time talking about security products and features on this show. And, we do have a whole array of security offerings here at Hornet Security. So if you are interested in checking out any of those, you can go to hornetsecurity.com for more information. All of the security products kind of center around securing the M365 cloud, as well as providing backup services, security awareness training, and lots more. So again, be sure to check that out. Other than that, thanks for watching. Stay safe out there. Have a good one. And we'll talk to you later.